Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Freight Forwarders Avoiding Costly Export Violations. My name is SenGupta, founder of DSG Global. The agenda for today is looking at the role of freight forwarders, looking at actual freight forwarder penalty cases, and that will give us a great lay of the land and understanding why freight forwarders have received penalties, what violations they have been accused and convicted of. We'll also look at guidance from the BIS on freight forwarders. The BIS has issued guidance in the past, and they have also asked us to look at red flags. So we'll be looking at that. Now, one area that shippers, corporations who are shipping, have a lot of confusion about is the whole routed exports and who should file the EEI and what is the freight forwarder's responsibility. So we're going to cover that as well. The government United States government also looks at diversion risk for transshipment very seriously and with a lot of concern. So we'll also cover transshipment and go over various best practices that the government recommends to minimize that risk. And finally, we'll cover some top 10 recommendations for freight forwarders as well as shippers who use freight forwarders to minimize export compliance penalties. So today is a 60-minute version, and we'll try to keep adequate time for questions. Thank you very much. Let's get started. Now, as many of you know, the role of a freight forwarder is really to facilitate the international trade transaction. Many times, they also help with imports into the United States, acting as your customs broker. But since the focus of today is exports, let's focus on the export role of freight forwarders. Freight forwarders, as listed below, can help you pick up the goods. If the Incoterms are either Ex Works or FCA, they could pick up the goods from your location. They can also prepare export documentation for you, book cargo, and really try to make your shipment go to the destination in a smooth and seamless manner. I have a lot of freight forwarders as customers, and they have to be regulated by the IATA, the International Air Transport Association, on air freight issues, as well as the Federal Maritime Commission on ocean issues for mostly ocean transportation intermediaries. But freight forwarders also need to comply with the Commerce Department, State Department, and Treasury Department rules, specifically regarding exports of dual use or civilian items, in addition to export of defense articles, which falls under the State Department jurisdiction, as well as OFAC, which deals with OFAC is the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is located in the State Department, in the Treasury Department, and deals with embargoed nations. Now, all of these agencies realize the importance of freight forwarders. They realize that many companies say, oh, my freight forwarder is going to take care of that for me. And they realize that freight forwarders are the last point of defense. But many government agencies scrutinize freight forwarder transactions because they also know that many smaller, medium-sized freight forwarders are just trying to get the shipments out of the door as well and may not have robust compliance programs. I have lost count of how many times companies tell me, oh, record keeping, or license determination, HTS numbers, my freight forwarder takes care of that. So, there's a lot of burden placed on the freight forwarders. So, the government, and over here we'll focus our talk mostly on export transactions that fall under the purview of the Commerce Department. Now, the Commerce Department has, two faces. One face is they are trying to promote exports of United States goods around the world. At the same time, there's a small bureau of commerce that's called the Bureau of Industry and Security. And they're trying to ensure that sensitive goods are not going into the wrong hands overseas, because there's a lot of unfriendly governments and foreign militaries or even terrorist supporting agencies that are trying to get their hands on certain electronic components that can be used in biological chemical weapons, missile technology, and other weapons of mass destruction. So the importance of freight forwarders cannot be understated. The government said, the BIS has said, that even though freight forwarders are acting on behalf of the buyer and or the seller, freight forwarders are just as liable, since they're an interested party in this transaction as well. These are the responsibilities of the freight forwarders according to the Bureau of Industry and Security. Freight forwarders must decide whether any transaction raises red flags. They can't just ignore the red flags. They're required to inquire about it. I'm sorry, if I could just place, if I could just have the attendees be on mute, thank you. So freight forwarders need to really examine red flags, and they can't just accept the exporter's information as sacrosanct. They really need to drill down. I just had a case yesterday where a company was shipping a laser, and their freight forwarder contacted me and said, Deep, this is the laser, it's going to China, does it need an export license? Now guess what? That laser exceeded the thresholds for which you need an export license, so we put that shipment on hold. Let's talk about some actual freight forwarder export penalty cases. There have been a lot of penalty cases over the last 5 to 10 years. There was a signature case, a landmark case, which was that of DHL, and that was one of the highest penalty cases ever. Until recently, we had the ZTE case, which went up to $800 million of BIS penalties, although the total penalty was in excess of $1 billion, including the Justice Department and Treasury Department penalties. But what we're going to focus on is freight forwarder cases. And before we go in, let me just tell you that the government has been looking at freight forwarders in a very big way over the last 10 years. There's also not enough training offered to freight forwarders. There's some organizations like the NCB FAA, the National Custom Brokers and Freight Forwarders Association, they provide training. But even the BIS, they used to offer some training for freight forwarders, but it's just not enough. And maybe because there's not enough opportunities for training is probably why freight forwarders, make some errors. So let's look at some typical examples. This is Access USA. This falls under one of these e-commerce freight forwarding companies that the governments are really looking at in a big way. Many times, now that e-commerce is booming, there are many freight forwarding companies who say, just buy your stuff online and just ship it to us in the United States, and we will then take care of the entire export clearance to your foreign customers. Well, what happened in this case, Access USA, it was a Florida-based package forwarding company, and on behalf of their overseas customers, they brought in rifle scopes, night vision lenses, weapons parts, and some other EAR 99 items that needed a license because they were going to people on the entities list, which means, it's a sanctioned entity. And there were over 129 counts of these mistakes. And finally, there was a $27 million civil penalty, and you can just see the number of counts of exporting or attempts to export certain items without a license. Now imagine, now this is a very, very small freight forwarder. It's a package forwarding company, and there are so many out there. And the government is really looking at these package forwarding companies in a big way. Now, it was so obvious that these items need a license that many times these night vision lenses would come in a box, and on the box it would say, the commercial invoice would say that it's controlled for exports, it's export controlled, and diversion outside the United States without the license is prohibited. Yet this company was so egregious. And let me just say that this practice is going on with many, many companies where many freight forwarders do not ask their customers what's in it. They just ask for some description, but they don't drill down and ask further information. This was another company, RIM Logistics. What they did is, it was really the fault of the shipper, which was the exporting company. They wanted to get some EAR engine parts to the Middle East. But the problem was, in this case, they wanted to ship it to Syria. Now, Syria is an embargoed country because of their government and human rights violations. And what happened is the government investigated, and usually they go back the chain. They see what goes into Syria, and they'll try to go back and see who was the freight forwarder, who was the shipper. Then they might set up a sting operation where they will, act as a potential buyer and, try to, in a sense, I don't want to use the word entrap, but, have a sting operation and arrest the company. So in this case, not only was the sales manager, indicted, but also the company received a penalty, and so did their freight forwarder. Now, in many cases like this, the freight forwarder is going to say, hey, it wasn't our fault. We didn't know that the goods were going to go to Syria. We just took it to the United Arab Emirates, but then it was sent to Syria. But, they should have done their due diligence. I just want to also mention a point with due apologies to all the sales professionals out there. I just want to say that the sales departments usually, for whatever reason, happen to be one of the most prolific culprits for export violations. And the reason is, it's not their fault. They're trained to close business, be aggressive, and get new customers in new markets. But it's obviously a gap in training, because they need to be told that certain markets are off limits, and those are the embargoed countries. They also need to be told that certain products, if it's in the commerce control list, may need a license before it's shipped out. And finally, they really need to be educated on export compliance in general. This was another company, very interesting, where the owner of the company and her company, RNA International Logistics, What they did is they falsified the identity of the exporter or the principal party of interest on SED and AES records. The reason they did that is because they were shipping to a certain distributor and there was some exclusivity or non-compete issues, and they still wanted to get that business, but they cheated and they put some wrong information on. In addition to that, when the government found out what was going on, this company tried to change the facts and reach out to the various parties involved and tell them, really to go along with their lies and not cooperate with the government. So they got some pretty steep penalties, jail time, and also a 5-year denial order from shipping. So that pretty much shut down their business. The DHL case was one of the biggest cases, because it had a $9 million penalty, and this was really a great company. It's overseas, around the world, one of the leading freight forwarding companies, but they failed to keep proper record keeping and copies of their airway bills and other export control documentation. So the government said that they aided and abetted unlicensed exports to Syria, Iran, and Sudan, which are all were embargo nations at that time, and the company DHL didn't have proper records. So there was a huge fine of $9.4 million because it covered like a 4-year period and numerous export violations. Even FedEx Express, and the point I'm trying to make here is that even the best run companies may run into violations. In this case, FedEx Express was charged with 6 violations, such as the following. Number 1, they were shipping an EAR 99 item, which was really 5A991. Another case, and they sent it to Dubai, which needs a license, but FedEx shipped it without knowing it needed a license. Now you can argue, well, FedEx can't research everything. It was the shipper or the exporter's responsibility. True, but then the government said if it's 5A991, FedEx should have had some checks and balances to know which ECCNs need a license to go to a certain destination, in this case, Dubai. Another area where FedEx got a penalty was where they shipped software to a laboratory, a university laboratory. It just so happens that that university laboratory was controlled as on the BIS entity list, which means you are not allowed to ship to them. And that was a huge $370,000 civil penalty. More recently, in a very similar case, Kintetsu also shipped certain machinery that was EAR 99. That means it didn't need a license because of its ECCN. It was a basic EAR 99 item. But the people who were receiving it, the Chinese National Precision Machinery Import-Export Corporation in China, was on the specially designated nationals list because they had done some work with Iran, and US companies were prohibited to doing business with that entity. So as a result, Kintetsu, which is a very well-known name in the freight forwarding world, got a $30,000 civil penalty. Recently, and this goes to the first case, the Florida-based package delivery company as well, there was another case of Fulfill Your Packages, which is another package delivery service. What they did is they received a thermal imaging camera, which can be used for nuclear weaponry. And then they repackaged it, relabeled it as machinery, and shipped it to China. These kind of issues, I'm very surprised that they only got a smaller penalty, but these companies obviously are doing things that are really harmful to national security. And I just want to mention on the previous slide that the government is really looking at these smaller freight forwarders that don't have a compliance program in place and really do anything the customers ask. And these package delivery and package forwarding companies especially have these egregious practices. And there are also other penalties for UN law sanction violations. There's this one a Chinese shipping company called Chinpo, and very interesting. They were going through the Panama Canal, saying that the ship was full of sugar, 10,000 tons of sugar, but when the Panama Canal authorities wanted to inspect it, they saw that there was 2 disassembled aircrafts and engine parts below the sugar. I mean, that was clearly a fraud. But the company's lawyer said, we had no idea. But obviously the court said that they failed to do their due diligence. Another problem that happened here was that the shipping company was actually doing some money laundering with certain entities in North Korea, which is clearly in violation of United Nations sanctions as well, in addition to US law. There was another case of Airsped, which is a Norwegian shipping company, where they were shipping licensable goods from the United Kingdom to Iran. And what they said was, our employee filled out the paperwork incorrectly, but really that's no excuse. Friends, I wanted to show you these examples, and there's a couple of more examples. But remember that 2 things. Freight forwarders are liable for penalties like never before, because the government's looking at them because they know they don't have good compliance programs. And also remember that about 2/3 of all the penalty cases against freight forwarders are actually related to shipping to people or places that they are not allowed to. And this could easily have been fixed with some training on which places you are not allowed to ship to, as well as training on who are the denied persons and adequate screening. The BIS has also issued freight forwarder guidance. And in their freight forwarder guidance, they've said that, again, it's the agent's responsibility to understand its obligations. And they've also mentioned that there could be significant penalties for freight forwarder violations. They've time and time again said that you need to look out for red flags. And they've also explained when red flags happen. For instance, quarter end, or there's lack of procedures, or lack of communication between the sales staff and the distributors. So you need to look out for red flags, especially if your VP of sales says, I don't care what list they're on, we need this sale. Or if the employees say, there's not something right about this transaction, then they need to review, refrain, or reevaluate the transaction. Here are some examples of product red flags. Number 1, if the product's capabilities just don't fit the buyer's line of business. What if the customer has little or no business background? Finally, if the product is incompatible with the technical level of the country it's being shipped to. Other examples of red flags are where a freight forwarder is listed as the product's final destination, or if the customer uses a PO box for a ship-to address. Let's also talk about routed export transactions. A routed export transaction occurs when a foreign purchaser or foreign principal party in interest requests to have their merchandise delivered to a location in the United States. The merchandise is retrieved by a freight forwarder or the other agent who's been contracted by the foreign purchaser. Now, the foreign principal party of interest can authorize the US PPI to file the EEI. And in order to do that, the US PPI must get a power of attorney from the foreign PPI. The US PPI must also obtain in writing from the foreign PPI express responsibility for determining licensing requirements and obtaining authorization for the export. If the agent is doing filing on behalf of the foreign PPI can authorize the agent to prepare and file the EEI. In addition, the agent is responsible for preparing the AES submission, maintaining documentation, and upon request, providing the US PPI with a copy of the AES filed. The EAR also has requirements on all the record keeping that needs to be maintained for every transaction, including by the freight forwarder. These include export control documents, purchase orders, memoranda, notes, correspondence, contracts, and other relevant financial records. Now let's talk about unlawful diversion through transshipment. What is transshipment? Transshipment is a very unfortunate illegal practice where the freight forwarders, in this case, might try to disguise the actual country of ultimate destination. So you might think it's going to one country, but then it's diverted to another unauthorized end user or end use. Now, the BIS has published a set of best practices that's called Best Practices for Industry to guard against unlawful diversion through transshipment trade. And here are the various best practices that they've included. Number one, companies should pay heightened attention to the red flag indicators on the BIS website and communicate any red flags to all divisions and branches, particularly when the exporter denies a buyer's order or a freight forwarder declines to provide export services for dual-use items. This actually happened in the case of Alcon Pharmaceuticals, where they were shipping to Iran and finally a freight forwarder said, you know, we decline to provide export services to you. The second best practice is where exporters or re-exporters only use trade facilitators or freight forwarders that administer sound export management and compliance programs that include best practices for transshipment. The third best practice is companies should know their foreign customers by obtaining detailed information on their bona fides of their customer to measure the risk of diversion. Best practice number 4, companies should avoid routed transactions when exporting and facilitating the movement of dual-use items, unless a long-standing and trustworthy relationship has been built among the exporter, foreign PPI, and the FPPI's US agent. Best practice number 6. An exporter re-exporter should provide the ECCN number or the EAR classification to the freight forwarders and should report in AES the ECCN for all export transactions, including when no license may be required. Best practice number 5. The exporter should provide the appropriate export control classification number and the destination where the items are intended to be used for all exports to the end user. Best practice number 7. Companies should use information technology to the maximum extent feasible to augment knowing your customer and other due diligence measures in combating the threat of diversion and increase confidence that the shipments will reach authorized end users. Let's finally talk about the recommendations that shippers and freight forwarders can use to minimize the risk for export penalties. Number 1, require that the shippers provide detailed HTS or HS codes. Set up an internal compliance program. Ensure management commitment. Create written procedures and identify responsible officials. Conduct know your customer risk assessments and have a red flag list. Screen all the parties to the transaction. Establish and maintain solid record-keeping practices. Conduct periodic audits. Develop a comprehensive training program. And finally, if you ever detect any violations, submit a voluntary self-disclosure to the BIS. Friends, with that, I'm delighted to take questions. We've got a couple of questions. For what aspects does the FMC issue penalties? Well, the FMC issues penalties for a couple of reasons. Number 1, if you do business as an ocean transportation intermediary without the requisite license, then you'll get a penalty. Also, other issues include failure to publish your tariff. Another question is, are there any other freight forwarder organizations that provide training? You know, as I mentioned earlier, the NCBFAA has an educational institute that is excellent, and its audience is freight forwarders. What if your customers are going to resend the goods and you know that they're going to transship the goods? Well, if you know that your customers are going to transship your goods, then there's a knowledge violation right there, and it's important to stop and refrain from the transaction right there and then. Another question is, do I have any suggestions for software for screening? Well, although I don't endorse anybody, I just want to say that there's a couple of tools out there like Integration Point, Amber Road, MK Denial. These are well-established names, but as I mentioned before, I do not endorse anybody. Friends, that concludes today's presentation on freight forwarders reducing the risk of export penalties. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.